Okay, we are continuing our study of the Gospel of Matthew here on the listener's commentary. And in this recording, we're going to be looking at Matthew chapter 14, verses 13 through 36. And let's just make sure we remember where we're at in the flow of Matthew's story. In context, Matthew has just narrated the death of John the Baptist. And so as he tells the story of John the Baptist's death, that actually sets up what happens here beginning in 14:13. We also learn from the other gospels that it's been a very busy season of ministry for Jesus. In fact, even the apostles have been going out on ministry tours, according to the other gospels. Luke's gospel actually ties all of this together with the disciples going out and Jesus being busy and John the Baptist being killed, and brings all that together. And so there's been a lot going on for Jesus and his disciples. Now, with the added risk from what recently happened to John the Baptist, Jesus decides it's time to head out into the country for a while. There's just a little too much attention being drawn to him, a little too much political heat right now. It's best just to get away, let things settle down for a bit. Also, in the preceding episode, Matthew highlighted the question, where does Jesus get this wisdom and these miraculous powers? And in the context of Matthew's overall narrative, he's told us that Jesus is Emmanuel, God with us. Well, this episode that we're going to look at in this recording continues to open their eyes and our eyes to the full identity of Jesus, the Son of God. And that'll actually be the culminating confession of all these little snapshots of people's various reactions to Jesus. That'll culminate in Matthew 16 with that confession from Peter and the disciples that Jesus is indeed the Son of the living God. So we pick up here with this story flowing directly out of the death of John the Baptist. Verse 13, now, when Jesus heard about John, he withdrew from there. And so that helps us see that even though it was a flashback scene in Matthew 1 through 12, it happened recently. It's a fairly recent event, and when Jesus heard about it, he withdrew from where he was in a boat to a secluded place by himself. He wants to get away. He needs some space. He wants to grieve the death of John the Baptist. He also knows that things are getting a little complex and a little too hot, and so he goes away to a solitary, a lonely, a secluded place by himself. And when the people heard about this, so some of the people that are in the cities where he's been doing ministry, when they heard about this, they followed him on foot from the cities. So Jesus knows that Herod's violence towards John and paranoia about Jesus, maybe being John back from the dead, could lead towards violence to himself. And he's not ready for that yet. When the right time comes, Jesus will walk directly into hostility and into his appointed task of offering his life for the world. But that time's not now. And so Jesus here withdraws to avoid that. And yet, he's trying to get away from the crowds, trying to get off by himself, but the crowds hear him talk about leaving, see him leaving, and they follow him. And so verse 14 says this, when he came ashore, remember, they're sailing, the crowds are on land. When he came ashore, he saw a large crowd and felt compassion for them and healed their sick. And so he's trying to get away, it doesn't work. Crowds meet up with him wherever he's sailing to, so he has compassion on them, and he heals many of their sick people. And then verse 15 continues by saying, now it was evening. It's late in the day. The disciples came to him and said, this place is secluded, and the hour is already past to eat. Send the crowds away so that they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves. Jews typically ate late in the afternoon, around 3-ish or 4. So it's sometime later in the afternoon, early eating, past the normal meal time, but early enough that vendors may be selling bread and food in the surrounding villages. And this is Matthew's introduction to the well-known story of the feeding of the 5,000, which is the only miracle that's told in all 4 of the Gospels. And that speaks to its importance for understanding who Jesus is. And when we compare all the details from all the accounts, here's what we see. We see that the feeding of the 5,000 happened sometime in the spring. Mark 6:39 mentions green grass. That's going to be earlier in the year. John 6:4 tells us that Passover was near when it happened, which means we're talking late March or early April. And many scholars suggest that this is about 1 year before Jesus' crucifixion. So he's already been doing ministry for about 2 years, and he's got about 1 more year before that final Passover. and his crucifixion. That's where we're at in Jesus' life and in Jesus' ministry. And so it's springtime, and Jesus is out by himself. These crowds have come. His disciples want Jesus to send the crowds away so they can maybe travel to whatever villages are close at hand and see if they can't find some bread and food for themselves. But Jesus said to them in verse 16, they don't need to go. You give them something to eat. As Jesus continues to teach and train the 12, which increasingly that's been his focus, is spending time with them and training them and preparing them for ministry after Jesus' death and resurrection. So as he continues that, he tells them to feed the crowd. And to all appearances, that's ridiculous. We're going to learn shortly that there's a crowd of 5,000 men, plus women and children. How in the world are they going to come up with so much food to feed all those people? It seems impossible. And that's how they respond. They don't have enough resources for that. The disciples, just like us, are still needing to learn Jesus' full power and ability and identity. And so they respond to him this way in verse 17. We have nothing here except 5 loaves and 2 fish. Now, John, in his account of this miracle, tells us that these loaves and fish come from a young boy. You can read that in John chapter 6, verse 9. And what you got to picture are flat, round loaves of bread and some dried or smoked fish. So you got 2 small smoked fish and a handful of round flatbread. That's what we have. These were staples of the Jewish diet, particularly here in Galilee, where fishing was a major food source. That's it. That's their major resources. But look what Jesus says. They say, we have nothing but 5 loaves and 2 fish, and Jesus said to them, verse 18, bring them to me. Bring them to me. Bring those meager resources to me and watch what happens. In verse 19, ordering the crowd to sit down on the grass, he took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, looked up towards heaven, and he blessed the food and broke the loaves. That's what happens here. Now, the phrase, he blessed the food, that phrase, the food, isn't in the original, but it's been supplied by the translators. And that's possible meaning, that he blessed the food. That would be the way we would say it. You bless the food, let's bless our food before we eat, right? That would be the way we speak, but it's probably more likely intended meaning that he blessed God, because that was the common way in their world for Jews to give thanks for food. They would say something like, blessed are you, O Lord our God, who brings forth bread from the earth. So when it says he blessed, it means he spoke a prayer of blessing to God for being the provider of everything they needed. So he blessed the food, and breaking the loaves, he gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowd. So this is what you have to picture. Jesus says this prayer of blessing to God, and then he begins breaking the fish into small pieces, breaking the bread into small pieces. I sort of picture it as the disciples going out, giving some food to one group of people, and then coming back and getting more. And Jesus just keeps breaking the bread, and it just keeps coming. He just keeps breaking the fish, and it just keeps coming. And Matthew tells us in verse 20, and they all ate and were satisfied. All of them, all these people, they all ate, and they ate to their fill. For some people, this might be the most food they've had in a while. Like there was plenty, more than enough, and everyone ate until they were completely satisfied, and they picked up what was left over of the broken pieces, and there were 12 baskets full. Notice that there were leftovers. Jesus made leftovers, and there was enough leftovers for the 12 who passed out the food. They were cared for too. And then Matthew tells us there were about 5,000 men who ate besides women and children. There was a massive crowd of people. We don't know the exact number, but if you're thinking about 5,000 men, then you have some women, then you have some kids, you're talking 10, 12,000 people. Huge crowd of people. And somehow they fed all those people with these 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. And so it raises the question for us, well, who is Jesus? Well, Jesus is the one who feeds them. Just like God provided manna in the wilderness for the people of Israel, so here Jesus in the wilderness provides food for people. In fact, John's account records Jesus teaching on this very theme after this event in John chapter 6, on being the bread of life and on God providing manna in the wilderness for the people. And so there is this implicit connection here with this story. It's sort of like what God says in Ezekiel. My flock strayed through all the mountains on every high hill. Where is Jesus and this crowd? They're on the hills, out in the country, outside of the cities. And God said through Ezekiel in that passage, he said that he himself will come and shepherd his people like sheep. I will feed them on the mountains of Israel, God says. By the streams and in all the inhabited places of the land, I will feed them in a good pasture, and their grazing place will be on the mountain heights of Israel. There they will lie down in a good grazing place and feed in rich pasture on the mountains of Israel. Those words come from Ezekiel 34, verse 6 and following. And Jesus here in this moment is embodying that promise. And so who is Jesus? Well, if you begin to put together what God promised through his prophets and you begin to reflect on that, you begin to get a glimpse here that maybe this is God come to us to feed us, to provide for us, to care for us, to shepherd us on the mountain heights of Israel. And that, I think, is why this story is told in all four of the Gospels, because as the Gospel writers looked back on this story, they caught the glimpse, they saw the message that Jesus is embodying the promise to be God shepherding his people. Well, immediately after feeding them, Matthew tells us in verse 22, Jesus compelled the disciples to get into the boat to go ahead of him back to the other side, and then he sends the crowds away. And verse 23, after the crowds went away, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. When it was evening, he was there alone. And so the disciples have gotten into the boat. They've sailed off. Jesus sent the crowds away. Jesus climbed a little higher up onto the hill, and he's all by himself, and he just wants to spend some time alone with his Father in prayer. And we actually see this regularly in all the Gospels. Luke highlights it more than the others, but all the Gospels mention it, that Jesus regularly found ways and found times and sought places where he could get off by himself to commune with his Heavenly Father. And since discipleship entails imitation, we who would be Jesus' disciples need to pay attention to this. This is important. It's been a busy season of ministry. John the Baptist has just been executed recently, and now he's just cared for this whole crowd for a whole day and fed them at the end of the day. Jesus needs some time alone and time away, specifically time away to pray. And so he's there by himself and he's praying. But as the night draws late and morning begins to come, here's what happens, verse 24. But the boat was already a long distance from the land, battered by the waves, and the wind was contrary. And so the wind has kicked up, the waves are coming, the disciples are in the boat trying to get back to the other side over by Capernaum where they had come from. And verse 25 says, in the fourth watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea. When is the fourth watch of the night? Well, it's between 3 and 6 a.m. So we don't know how late it was when they sent the crowd away and everything wrapped up for the day. Guessing since it was already late in the day when they started, it was a pretty late night for the apostles. And so Jesus sent them off in the boat. He goes off to pray. And now in the middle of the night, pitch dark, they're struggling with the boat. It's not going well. And so Jesus comes to them walking on the sea, Matthew says. And verse 26, when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, "It's a ghost." And they cried out in fear. That word ghost is phantasma. It's only used here and in the parallel in Mark 6:49 with this story. It refers to a disembodied spirit or an apparition. We have to understand that they're out in the sea. The winds have whipped up. The Jews had sort of a fear of the sea anyhow because they viewed it as a place of chaos, and they viewed it as something that only God could contain and control, right? And this, it was kind of the portal almost to the underworld in some ways and a place of chaos. And so here now comes Jesus in the middle of the night walking on the sea, and their first reaction is, it's got to be a ghost. Come out of the chaos, come out of the underworld, walking on the sea. But immediately, Jesus spoke to them saying, "Take courage, it is I. Do not be afraid." And Jesus reassures them in this moment. And he does so by drawing attention. It's me. It's I. Now, a couple things about that phrase, "it is I." This is the standard way that you would say in Greek, "it's me." And that's the primary point, to reassure them that it's Jesus and not a ghost. But here's the thing. That phrase, "it is I," is also the exact same phrase used in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, for God's name in Exodus 3:14. So in this scene with Jesus walking on the water, where they believe that only God has the capacity to control the seas and walk on the water, it sure seems to me like they would have had to have heard something more than a simple "it's me," right? Psalm 77, verse 19, Job 9:8, both of those describe God as the one who walks on the sea. Even the intertestamental book, Sirach, says God walked on the waves of the sea. This is the Jewish worldview. God's the one who can do it, and God's the only one who can do it. So in this worldview, when one comes walking on the sea and uses ego eimi, the very phrase used in the Septuagint for the name of God, what do you suspect they might hear? And that seems to be the point at this point in the story. Who is this one? And Peter responded and said to Jesus, "Lord, if it's you, command me to come to you on the water." And Jesus said to him, "Come." And so Peter climbs out of the boat. Remember, it's kind of windy and it's wavy, and you got at least not a massive storm, but you at least got enough wind to have whipped up the sea. Peter got out of the boat and he walked on the water, walking towards Jesus. But then all of a sudden, seeing the wind, he became frightened. And when he began to sink, he cried out, saying, "Lord, save me." And Jesus reached out his hand and took hold of him and said, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they got into the boat, the wind stopped. And then we get really the climax of this section. It's actually the message I think Matthew wants us to hear in verse 33. Those who were in the boat worshiped him, saying, "You truly are the Son of God." Notice that they worshiped him, and Jesus received that worship. And yet, for Jews, the only one you worship is God. And they're beginning to get some sense of who is this one. And when they say you're truly God's son, first off, that's a messianic title. That really is. Psalm chapter 2, a well-known psalm about the Messiah, reads like this: "But as for me," God speaking, "I have installed my king upon Zion, my holy mountain. I will announce the decree of the Lord. He said to me, 'You are my son. Today I have fathered you.'" And so to be God's son, it means to be God's king here. And so it was a messianic title to say he's God's son. But Jesus' words and Jesus' actions are beginning to expand their understanding and our understanding. What does it really mean for Jesus to be God's son? He's not just your ordinary Son of God, Messiah, King sort of figure. He seems to be far more than that. And when Matthew writes these words, he has a full understanding of who Jesus is as God's Son. And he tells his story to help people see that Jesus is God's Son in a most unique way, that he can do only the kinds of things that God can do, like walk on the seas, that Jesus as God's Son embodies the promises that God himself said that he would feed his people on the mountains of Israel. And Matthew then wraps up this story with a quick little summary statement that we will deal with in more detail in our next section. But let's just read it here. It says this: "When they had crossed over, they came to the land at Gennesaret, a large plain on the northwest side of the sea, not too far from Capernaum. And when the men of that place recognized him, they sent word into all the surrounding region and brought all who were sick. And they pleaded with him that he might just touch the border of his cloak, and all who touched it were cured." Now, we'll deal with some of the details in that section in our next recording. But here, just note how this little summary statement at the end of this emphasizes Jesus' immense popularity and his great power. And that's where we're at in Jesus' ministry. Before we leave this, let me just offer a brief reflection. Matthew has painted a picture of Jesus as God's son in such a way to show us that it's more than just the normal royal title. Indeed, he is the king, but he does what Yahweh does. Like a good shepherd, he feeds his people on the hills of Israel. He walks on water. So who is this one? Where did he get this power? And the answer Matthew seems to be telling us is he's God's unique son in a surprising and comprehensive way. He's Emmanuel, God with us, and he cares for his own. All right. Thanks for tuning into this session on the listener's commentary on the Gospel of Matthew. The listener's commentary is a listener-supported, crowd-funded Bible teaching ministry that only exists because of the generosity of people just like you. So to each and every one of you who support this ministry, thanks a ton for making this possible. And if you have been blessed or impacted in some way by the listener's commentary, would you prayerfully consider joining the team of supporters? Easiest way to do that is to go to listenerscommentary.com, click the Give button, and it'll redirect you to a page through World Family Mission, my page, where you can put in a dollar amount, click a little box that says Make This Monthly, and set up a monthly donation, or don't click the box and give a one-time donation as well. Thanks a ton in advance for your support.